Good morning. Welcome back to our Fireside Chats with Mackinac State Historic Parks. My name is Phil Porter. I'm former director of the parks, and it's my pleasure to share with you some of the rich and fascinating stories that are part of Mackinac and its wonderful history. Over 4,500 soldiers served at Fort Mackinac during its 125-year history. These were soldiers that were part of the British Army and later the American Army. Now, we know the names of many, if not most, of these soldiers because of military records that are in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. But we also know specifically about some soldiers that were here because they actually left their names on the walls of some of our buildings. This is our historic graffiti, and that's what we're going to share with you today, some of the names of soldiers and some of the graffiti that is still here and helps to document the original nature of Fort Mackinac. Let's start by going in the Quartermaster storehouse. The Quartermaster storehouse in Fort Mackinac is an original building like all of our buildings. It was basically a warehouse where they stored the hardware that was used by the soldiers, everything from their military uniforms, the pots and pans that they cooked with, the paints that they painted with, and so on. It was kind of a big, like I said, a big warehouse. One of the things that was stored here was paint, and I think it was just irresistible for some of those soldiers who could dip a brush into the paint and leave either their names or a little bit of graffiti on the wall. A couple of examples are right here in front of us. Here you see a couple of dates that were marked 1893 and 1883. Then right next to it are the initials QMD for Quartermaster's Department. And above that, somebody's initials, HC, we're not sure who that was, but undoubtedly a soldier who was perhaps on painting duty who decided he would paint more than just the buildings. He'd leave his initials here in the fort as well. As we go a little farther over here, you'll notice that there are several names of soldiers who also dipped their brush into some black paint and they left their names here. All of these names appear on the muster rolls of the time period when these soldiers served here. Now these are interesting, but the most interesting graffiti that we have is in the post guardhouse, and we'll go there next. The post guardhouse at Fort Mackinac was built in 1828. It's actually the third guardhouse in this fort. The first one was actually moved from Fort Mackinac during the American Revolutionary War in 1780 and 81. This guardhouse has been here again since 1828, and like all guardhouses, it served two functions. One is that it was the center of the daily guard duty. Men were put on this duty for a 24-hour period, and it was their job to march the sentry beats around the fort, make sure that nobody attacked, and equally important, making sure that none of the soldiers deserted from the fort as well. The other function of the post guardhouse was that it was the place where soldiers were incarcerated for various military crimes. When we go inside, we're going to take a little bit closer look at the two rooms in there and some of the graffiti that was left behind by some of the misbehaving soldiers. In the early years, military discipline at Fort Mackinac was very severe, very brutal. Soldiers in the late 18th and early 19th century could be flogged up to 75 or 100 times for disobeying military orders. They could be incarcerated not in the cell that we now have above ground, but actually in this black hole, which was the early cell that was used for soldiers. It's very damp, very dark, a very uncomfortable place to be incarcerated if you misbehaved. That was shut down later, and soldiers then would spend their time in the cell room, and we'll take a look in there now. Again, this is the cell room. It had a barred door. Soldiers would be incarcerated in here, and in the 1880s, the period that we interpret here at Fort Mackinac, soldiers would have been tried for either in garrison court-martials or general court-martials. Garrison court-martials took care of the less severe crimes, things like fighting with other soldiers or being absent without leave. General court-martials were much more severe cases. That would be for striking an officer or for desertion. Garrison court-martials were quite frequent. In fact, between 1884 and 1889, there were over 300 garrison court-martials here at Fort Mackinac. Again, a lot of different minor petty crimes, and many of them had to do with the soldiers having a little bit too much to drink and being drunk and disorderly. Two soldiers that were incarcerated here in 1889 were Henry L. Kuhn and Arthur Whaley. Both of them came to Fort Mackinac as a part of Company K, 23rd Regiment of Infantry, in December of 1888. They only spent about a year and a half here, but some of their time was spent in this cell. Arthur Whaley was just in here once. We know he's here again because we're going to see where he carved his name into the windowsill. Henry L. Kuhn was here 5 different times, and it was for a variety of offenses, but almost all of them had to do with the fact that he would have too much to drink and he would either be drunk and disorderly or he would be absent from one of his military duties. But again, while they were in the cell at the same time together in 1889, they carved their name into the windowsill of the small barred window that looks out over the parade ground. As you look closely at this, you'll see the initials HLC. Henry L. Kuhn was again the person who carved his name in there. And then below that is A. Whaley, and he of course dated that 1889. So again, we know both men were here, and they carved their names right into this windowsill. For years it had been covered up with paint, and when we restored the building about 25 years ago, we cleaned off the paint and discovered this wonderful piece of historic graffiti. It always made me wonder, though, how they could carve their name into the windowsill, because they had to use something sharp like a knife, and I'm not sure how they got the knife past the guards and into the cell here, but sure enough they did. Their names are here. Again, it documents that they served at Fort Mackinac and that this is an original Fort Mackinac building.